I was told that there's going to be a young audience here, and I'm not that young anymore. So I'm going to start with a question, which is, how many of you are familiar with this movie? You guys, have you seen Avatar? Okay, so I'm not that old. You know, Avatar is still a movie that serves as a reference. And the reason why I want to start the talk by talking to you about this movie is that, this was a movie that had kind of like a very special technology, which was this tree of souls. Basically, these people that live in this planet that look primitive originally actually had a very advanced technology that allowed them to collect all of their memories of their civilization in this tree that would span the planet. And that's why they were so adamant about protecting their planet, because they had that tree of souls that allowed them to collect their memories. And I'm going to argue that in our society, we also have a tree of souls. That tree of souls, that we have, we call it the internet. And the problem with this tree of souls is that even though it helps us to store our memories, we have the pictures of our birthdays or of our children on Instagram and Facebook and Snapchat and so forth, it's a tree of souls that is rather imperfect. And I'm going to talk about those imperfections because those are going to help us understand our collective memory. What are the things that survive in our memory and what are the things that disappear? And there are three sources of imperfection that I want to cover. The first one is that our tree of souls is deeply fragmented by languages. There are memories that are stored in Hungarian or in English or in Italian or in Chinese. And we're going to see that affects our memory, who becomes famous, for instance, and who is remembered. But also, our tree of souls decays with time. Things don't last forever. An anecdote, like a few years ago, I was working in my office at MIT. I was, listening to music, and Imagine from John Lennon was playing on the computer. And a master student comes in, and I ask her, "Do you know who this is?" And she says, "Is that Coldplay?" And for me, that was so surprising because I thought Imagine was a song that was, of course, always going to be remembered as an icon of music. But for her, Coldplay or, John Lennon or the Beatles were more or less interchangeable because she was from a different time in which the references had changed. And we tend to forget that those reference changes, but they do. So we're going to see how memory changes with time. And it's also limited by technology. And this is a very important factor that we're going to cover because what we remember, the messages that we transmit, are deeply shaped by the technologies that we use to communicate. So let's get into the subject. Let's see how memory changes with languages, time, and technology. So I'm going to start with time. And I'm going to start with an observation that we had about, maybe now 8 years ago. So I had a student, Christian Candia, who was working at my lab. And he was, very much interested in music. And he had collected data from Spotify about the most popular songs in Spotify. And we decided to compare those rankings of popularity with the rankings of popularity from Billboard. Billboard was a traditional magazine, on print that would print popularity rankings based on the sales of records and cassette tapes and so forth. And when we did that, we found something that was quite interesting. We found that the popularity of a song in Spotify today decayed as a function of the data it was introduced into the Billboard ranking, but that decay was not linear. It had like this sort of bend or knee. And that was kind of weird, that knee has to come from somewhere. So we wanted to understand that. We're scientists, of course, so we wanted to understand that. And that was weird, not only because maybe it's counterintuitive, but also because as scientists, we had the intuition that things should work the other way around. When you release something, it first becomes popular, has a period of growth, and then it has a period of decay. If you release a movie, people start going to see them, and then they stop seeing it. But the other chart doesn't go up and then down. It just goes down and then down a little bit slower. So what we discovered is that, this curve that you see here, which is the standard adoption curve for a cultural product, actually can be decomposed. It can decompose into two curves. One curve, that goes up. And this is the preferential attachment idea. For example, the Hungarian physicist Laszlo Barabasi has worked a lot on this idea, that things become popular because they're popular. The more people know about something, the more that they're going to talk about that. And that generates that growth, The other effect is the decay effect. And to observe that decay effect, you have to control for the first of the two effects. Now, Okay, so the first effect goes up, you see? As things are more popular, they continue to become more popular. Popularity begets popularity, you know? But once you control for that, you start observing this decay effect. So what we were observing when we looked at the popularity of songs that were on Billboard, it was not a random collection of songs. These were all songs that have achieved a very high level of popularity. So they were comparable, and we were implicitly controlling for the first effect. So now we could decompose this, we could explain this, and we could come up with a model that would help us understand why there was a knee on the curve. And the model is quite simple, is that when things become popular, at the beginning, people talk about them. You know, so popularity first is an oral phenomena. It's communicative memory. And you can think that this communicative memory exists today also through digital means. Like people are talking, you know, on Twitter about, you know, current events, whether it is the United States election or whether it is, you know, other event that it's very recent. But eventually, that communication fades off. People change topic. But in the process of communicating, we're generating records that then become cultural memory, like written records that we can collect later. So I'm sure that in the 1950s and 60s, everybody in Hungary was talking about Puskás. Now, you know, you still can have information about him, but you go to more historical sources like the Wikipedia and so forth to look at that information. And that is the second stage of decay, the one that now is dominated by those cultural records. And we're able to show that this is a quite universal phenomena. So if you look at scientific papers, patents, music, the popularity of tennis players, movie trailers, and so forth, they all follow this law of decay that has these two stages. So forgetting is there, and forgetting is universal, but also forgetting satisfies well-defined statistical laws is fast at the beginning because conversations peter out, and it's slow later because cultural memory stays here for longer. So that's what we know about time. Now let's see what we know about languages. So what I'm going to show you here is a network in which each node is a language, and languages are connected based on the probability that a book was translated from one language to the other. So this is a data set of about 2.2 million book translations. And you see that this network, of course, has a lot of structure. It's not a random jumble of nodes and links. No, in the center, you have English, which is kind of like the center of this, you know, linguistic world. And then you have local hubs. For example, Russian there connects to a lot of languages from Central Asia. You know, and then you have Chinese. It's a very big language. It's a big node. A lot of people speak Chinese, but it doesn't connect to many other languages. You know? And then you have French, for instance, that connects to a lot of languages in West Africa. And we mapped several of these networks because we wanted to understand actually how languages shape collective memory. So we mapped them using books. We also mapped them using, you know, information from, you know, Wikipedia and Twitter. So here you have Twitter data, and here we look at whether a person that tweets in English also tweets in Spanish or also tweets in Portuguese and so forth. And in Wikipedia, we look at editors, and we see if an editor that edited a Wikipedia page in English also edited a Wikipedia page, for instance, in Russian, in French, in Spanish, and so forth. And we could use these networks to determine the centrality of each one of these languages. And that centrality matters. Why? Because the world is connected, but it's not connected in a way in which everyone can talk to everyone. So, for example, if someone in Peru learns about events that are happening in Gaza today, maybe it's not because it's coming directly from a source that happens to speak Arabic and happens to speak Spanish. Maybe this was translated, you know, first, you know, from Arabic to English, and then from English, you know, to Spanish. And in those paths, of course, we color the stories with our own perception. So these network maps of languages, you can think of them as a very aggregate social network of the world, because at the end of the day, you can only have friends or professional relationships with people that you can speak to. So we wanted to know actually if those languages really matter. You know? So we decided to test, you know, this hypothesis by using data from Pantheon. Pantheon is an observatory of collective memory that we created, and that contains information from hundreds of thousands of biographies and allows us to basically measure collective memory across time using these biographies as a proxy. So what we did is, you know, grab all of this information from Wikipedia, created structured data about it, and creating rankings of popularity that we could use, to explore different collective memory effects, like the ones that I shown before, for instance, in time. Here you have like a ranking of popularity. So you have, of course, a few people that have Wikipedia language editions in many languages. Like Leonardo da Vinci is present in hundreds of different language editions of Wikipedia. But if you look even at the Beatles, you see that John was before Paul, because he has more language editions than Paul, and they come exactly in the order that you might expect. John, Paul, George, and then Ringo. So we could use this data to now have a measure of how many famous people were produced by each language group and compare that with different hypotheses. Are, for example, English-speaking musicians so popular because, the United States and the UK are very rich or they're very populous? We could compare those things. And what we find is actually that what really matters is the centrality of a language in the language network. So we would compare these different hypotheses: population, GDP per capita, or the centrality on Twitter, Wikipedia, or the book translation network. And the one that really explains the number of famous people is the centrality on, for instance, this book translation network. So it's not, that, let's say, English or French are languages that are spoken by a rich elite, but is that they're languages that connect the world. And that's what gives prominence to the people in those languages. The last effect that I want to talk to you about is about technology, okay? And this is a very interesting one because we could use this Pantheon data now to look at the long, history of collective memory. So here you have a chart that on the y-axis shows you the number of famous people born in a year per million people, So this is called like the probability that your son or your daughter would grow up to be someone famous like Michelangelo, or Taylor Swift. And you see that this curve is rather flat for a long period of time, okay? So between the year 500 BC to a little bit before the year 1500, the number of famous people that were being produced or that at least made it into today's Wikipedia in several languages was more or less a constant. It was proportional to the world population. The population of the world was growing, but the number of famous people per capita was growing at a constant rate. And then around the year 1500, something happens and there's this blip that is actually statistically significant. What do you think happened then? Printing. In 1450, the introduction of printing is one of the most fascinating things that you're ever going to read about. And that changed not only the number of people that we remember, but who we remember. So this is a matrix showing the famous people by category before the year 1400. So you have many political leaders like kings and emperors and so forth, religious figures, whether prophets or popes and so forth, some writers and philosophers, but very little science, very little arts, very little of the rest. And after printing comes along and you have an increase in collective memory, our species uses that increase in collective memory to populate the tree of souls with new information. It's not more kings and more religious figures, but actually, what printing brings us is into a world in which now we have famous painters, famous composers, famous mathematicians, astronomers. Printing, for instance, developed a revolution in the sciences because it was the first time that data could be fixed. Before, when data was transcribed by hand, astronomical tables would introduce mistakes repeatedly as they would be produced. But when printing came along, you could fix that information. It was for the first time in history also that scientists could have a lot of books. Books used to be as expensive as a house at the time of Gutenberg, more or less, So they were extremely expensive and they were items that, kings would gather, but scientists would have little access to. So it was an enormous revolution. But that was not the last revolution because printing actually, had several eras. And there's a second era of printing, that develops after the Reformation in which printing turns, into much quicker formats. Journals and newspapers come along. And now you see that there's no constant rate of production of famous people anymore. Now it's growing linearly. So it means that actually it's growing quadratically because we're dividing by population already once in the, in the y-axis. And in the second printing era, you have, once again, a change in which the sciences, start becoming really large. You have the development of what Habermas calls the public sphere, and you have an explosion in the sciences during the Enlightenment in which Now you have famous physicists, chemists, biologists, mathematicians, a lot of writers, composers, painters, and artists as well. So the world really becomes a cultural mecca, not so much a political mecca as it used to be before, during the Enlightenment, during that era of writing. But of course, we have developed communication technologies today that go beyond printing. And that changed our world again. I want you to pay special attention here to the arts, because in the time of printing, you see that the arts are very much about the composers, the writers, the creatives. But when film and radio come along, the arts change. And it's no longer Shakespeare the one that becomes famous. It's Brad Pitt the ones that become famous. It changes from the creatives to the performers. And we're going to have a change in our collective memory that is induced by this change in technology, in which we now have famous actors, musicians, and singers being the ones that collect the fame from those works, not necessarily the composers. And finally, we have the introduction of television. Unfortunately, with this data set, we can say little about the introduction of the internet, because this is based on the biographies of people that have become globally famous. And it takes a little bit of time to become globally famous, so you have to wait a little bit of time to get this type of data. But historically, when we see the introduction of television, we have an increasing collective memory that goes into a different group of people. In the era of film, we have, on radio, we have famous musicians, we have famous singers, we have famous actors. But on television, we have a new type of celebrity that emerged, which is the sports player. Because you don't go to the cinema to watch a soccer game. You go to the cinema to watch a movie that took maybe 7 years to produce. But soccer game, is something that it's live. You have to watch it in the moment. And television is actually the medium for that. It's one of the few things that television still makes money on is, sports. And you have a world now that it's, largely dominated by performers, but also by sports players, soccer players, tennis players, race car drivers, and so forth. So this shows you that the composition of our collective memory has been changing every time we experience these continuities in our communication technologies. Our collective memory is not constant, but is shaped by the technologies that we have. This should remind you of Marshall McLuhan's famous phrase, the medium is the message. This is the idea that what is more consequential to our collective memory is not the messages that we communicate, but the mediums that we use to communicate them, because each medium determines which type of messages are good for that medium. What works on TikTok would have not worked on the world of early printing. There are very different formats that work for each communication era. So how do we know that this is causal and this is not just a correlation? So here I'm going to get a little bit more scientific, and I'm going to use my last minute for that. How we know this is causal? So here you have a map of the printers in Europe between 1450 and 1500. Printing was an enormous revolution. We like to think about the past, in terms of, the world moving slower than it does today. That was not true. When printing was, invented by Gutenberg and quickly stolen by Fust, it spread, very quickly throughout Europe. And by the year 1500, the number of printers per capita had become a stable number because the market had saturated. And you had stacks of books being accumulated, in Piazza San Marco in Venice, because the overproduction was so large, the boom had been so enormous. But the nice thing about this is that printing didn't originate everywhere. It originated in a single place. And for every place that was not mines, the access to that knowledge was something that was exogenous, was something that they didn't have a role in. So for instance, Strasbourg is very close to Mainz. It's also a city in which Gutenberg and Fust had lived and had access to printing much earlier, for instance, than Lisbon, which was a city that was very far, from Mainz, and would learn about printing much later. So you can use the distance between a city and Mainz as a way to isolate the effect of printing from all other effects. Because the probability that someone famous is born in a country changes, of course, with many factors, population, wealth, whether you are in the coast, and all of those type of things. But printing only affects one channel. Affects only, the distance to Mainz only affects the probability that you adopt printing because of that exogenous access to information. So you can isolate that causal factor, and when you do that, you actually find that there's a very strong effect that if you were closer to mine, you adopted printing earlier, you developed your first famous scientist earlier, your first famous artist earlier, but you don't develop a your first famous politician, because that was something that survived well in the oral culture. So in this presentation, I wanted to teach you a few things about how our collective memory changes with languages, time, and technology. Our collective memory is precious. It is the tree of souls from Avatar, but it also follows well-defined principles. Thank you.
It's time for questions and answers. If you guys have any questions, please raise your hand so I can see you. Yes, we have a gentleman over there in the upper deck.
You probably heard about a game called Divers, which is pretty popular. I think like half a year ago it was published. And it started popular, dropped a little bit, but it is stagnated since then. Why do you think that is? Like, why doesn't it fall continuously?
Well, you're talking about something that it's in the context of, you said, maybe a year or a year and a half?
Half a year. A little bit.
Half a year, yeah. So of course, in half a year, that's even a fraction of a segment of one of the lines that I show. I usually, we're looking here at long periods of time. So to see that decay for like that game of Helldivers, you're probably going to find that knee in cultural products that might be relatable. We don't have video game data, but we have film data. In about 5 years, you would see that knee, and then you would see the other length of decay coming after that. So the question that this presentation would try to answer is how popular is Helldivers in the version that is right now, in the year 2050, not in 2-3 months from now. That is a different type of dynamics. It's a short-term market adoption dynamics.
Thanks for your question. Yes, we have someone in the front row over here.
Thank you. I would like to ask you about the Mandela effect. If have you seen any correlation that how can it be that we, remember things, everybody remember things, but it wasn't actually true that way?
Yeah, so the Mandela effect is the idea that there are these false collective memories that are generated, And it's related, of course, to the idea of misinformation that we have right now. And you do have famous examples. People tend to think that misinformation is a modern phenomena. But how many of you have heard of this phrase, let them eat cake, from the French Revolution? Let them eat cake by Marie Antoinette. The idea is that, people, they told her, people don't have bread to eat. Let them eat cake. Actually, she said, let them eat brioche. It wasn't cake, it wasn't gâteau, it was brioche. But the point is that Marie Antoinette never said that. That was actually political propaganda, from the revolutionaries that was very effective. It's so effective that today we still remember that phrase. So you do have kind of like those false memories. And in some way it's because collective memories depend on this spreading phenomena, depends on our ability to communicate. And if there's something that is false and that spreads, eventually it becomes part of our memory and it gets really hard to contest. Really hard to remove, because people also tend to not pay too much attention to the things that they think that they already know. The easiest way to lose a reader is to tell them something that they think that they already know, because they're going to skip that part and they're going to, basically come out of the concentration that you need them to have to follow, your stream of thought. So it's a phenomena that we have there, and that it wouldn't be different from what we would observe maybe for true information.
Great question. Thank you for that. Do we have any more? Yeah, we've got someone in the middle over there in the back next to the camera.
Yeah. My question is, do you think these language hubs that you've shown, that their relevance is going to stay over time? Or do you think that there will be one language hub that will come to dominate all the others, like English is probably going to be? So is that stable? Is that going to change? Have you investigated this?
Yeah, so it's hard to have long-time series data, but anecdotally, for example, French used to be a much more important language than it is today. And English has become a lingua franca, just like Latin was a lingua franca at the time of printing. I do think that we live in a world in which the globalization had gotten to a point in which it's going to be very hard to remove English as the global language hub. And the fact is that, I'm a Chilean speaking with a Hungarian, without being able to speak Hungarian in my case, and I don't know if you speak Spanish or a Chilean version of Spanish, So we do have like this language that generates a strong network effect, because I use English not to communicate to English speakers, but when I travel to, Vietnam, or if, even in France where I live, sometimes I use English as well, because it is a language that has become that global hub. So I don't think that has the potential to change soon. But I think it has changed enormously throughout history in eras that were less globalized than the ones that we have right now.
Great question. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is the end of our session. I'm so sorry, sir. That's the end of our session with César Hidalgo. But César, if they want to reach out to you and ask questions, where can they do that?
At the Center for Collective Learning. So I have a lab here in Budapest at Corvinus University. It's called the Center for Collective Learning. We study collective memory. We study knowledge diffusion. We study a lot of different things. So if you search for the Center for Collective Learning in Google, you're going to find our webpage. You're going to find ways to connect with us very easily.
Yeah, perfect. So you can go ahead and do that. Yeah. But in the meantime, please give it up for César Hidalgo, everybody.
Thank you.